Hey, everybody. Welcome to your Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. Sarah, do you like our new theme song?
I love it, and I'm so excited. This was something that was written specifically for us, Denise, by Ina Bluma, who we love. They have done so much for us. So, yeah.
I love it. We were just talking about wanting to refresh for this new season, and they were literally like, we're on it. And like a week later had created this for us.
They're
so
so
we
good.
hope you enjoy it too. But Sarah, how have you been?
I have been good. It's a busy season for Velvet Ashes. So much good stuff to talk about.
So much good stuff to talk about. Yes, and I just got to be in Texas visiting Velvet Ash's friends, and I got to stay in a guest house for global workers that is totally free to use, called Casa del Sol. It was amazing. And so putting a little plug in there, if you're ever in Midland, Texas, or America and craving something that feels like Africa, maybe you need to look up Casa del Sol and our good friends, Tyler and Bailey, who run that. So
fun.
So fun. Okay. You mentioned so many things coming up, which we're going to get to. So many things in the Velvet Ashes calendar that we want you all to be aware of. But first, we have an item of business to discuss.
So important.
So important. It's the poll that we did last month in the Velvet Ashes community on Instagram. We asked the question, do you use a microwave? Sarah, do you use a microwave?
Now I do. I did not have one on the field.
Same. And so when we got back from serving on the field, I felt like we had to retrain ourselves as to, what do you use this thing for? Why do I want to use this? I'm just so used to like getting out a pot and reheating stuff.
Right, getting out a pot, or we had like a little, it was bigger than a toaster oven, but just like a little oven that we used. And so we would just reheat things in that. And I kind of thought, I have lived for 5 years without a microwave. I won't get back into it. I won't need one. But then I quickly realized how nice it was and definitely rely on it.
We're not getting into, are these terrible for you or not? What is that?
Right. Right.
One of the house that we moved back home, when we moved back to our passport country, the microwave that we used, every time we started it, it interrupted the Wi-Fi. It made everything wireless turn off. And I don't want to understand what was going on there. I don't want to think too hard about it, but it happened.
Right.
All right. So the majority of our Velvet Ashes users, listeners, community definitely use a microwave. 76% of you out there are microwave users. And so 24, I don't know if it's not available where you are, or you are just holding strong to convictions that you do not fall to the microwave. So then follow up to this question, we said, okay, what do you use now in your host culture that you never used in your passport culture? So Sarah, what would that have been for you if you were answering this question? I don't even know if you answered it. I didn't look.
I did not respond when we put the question box up, but I did see my response echoed in several people, and that would be a rice cooker. I was not even a big rice eater. I didn't grow up. My parents didn't cook rice a lot.
Asia was probably a remedy for that.
Yes, that changed very quickly. And a rice cooker was one of the first things that my teammate and I purchased when we arrived. And I did not expect how much I would fall in love with having a rice cooker. It's obviously possible to cook rice on a stove, but I never learned to do that. And so when I came back to my passport country, a rice cooker was one of the first things that I purchased so that I would have one. Yes. Yeah. I couldn't bring, the one from Asia because it would have been a different voltage and all of that kind of thing. But
that's true. Yeah. That's true. Okay. I feel like people cooking rice they have strong opinions about how you do it. It's a rice cooker, or it's this much water, or do you put the lid on or off? I have heard of people that cook it off for a while and then put it back on. And like, there's all these opinions about cooking I have a confession that I have never owned a rice cooker, Sarah, even to this day. Maybe I'm missing out.
I feel like it is so easy. You put it in, and maybe I just, have gotten into a rhythm of, I know the water amount for the way that I like it. But yeah, then in 30 minutes, it's ready.
Thank you, Asia, for the rice cooker.
Yes, right.
Okay, so mine is an electric kettle and also
Mm.
echoed over and over. I
Mm-hmm.
felt like
Mm-hmm.
in my growing up, that was never something we had in a home. And still, I think when I come back and I visit people who have lived cross culturally, I see it in their homes, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily a staple here in America with people. I don't know, but I'm like, whenever it was one of those when we got there, I was like, this is fantastic. Why
I
why
know.
do we not have more of these? So yeah, electric kettle. I was dying at some of the things people said. One of my favorites was booty sprayer, which I'm assuming we're talking about a bidet here. If not, there's something
Right.
I'm out there I'm totally not aware of. But um, those I feel like I was very skeptical about. And then COVID happened and the toilet paper crisis
Mm-hmm.
all
Right.
over the world. And all of a sudden, there are these things called bidets that are gaining popularity where I live in America
Mm.
right now. What
Yes.
about
Did you
you? Have you?
did you have those in Africa?
No, I feel
Okay.
like toilet paper was a luxury where we were at. Definitely not a bidet, but but since I've gone and visited global workers in Japan and I've realized,
Mm.
oh, this is like a real deal and these
Mm-hmm.
are not the shady contraption that I thought them to be.
Right.
I could get on board with that. Yeah. What about you? Did you have them?
Yes, we had them in Asia, definitely in like the fancier places. Not so much, once you got into the more rural areas, they didn't necessarily have running water, and so it was not possible. But yeah,
Right. Right. Okay, what were some was there anything that stood out to you as you looked through? We had like over 150 women respond to the box of what you use, and many of them with multiple things. What was one that stood out to you?
yeah, I definitely noticed the ones that I kind of identified with. So like a clothes drying rack, not having a dryer. That was
Yes.
definitely something that I kind of had to learn to use and appreciated. House help was one.
Okay, yes, that's true. That's if you know, you know. It's
Right.
awkward to get used to, and then it's definitely a relationship and a rhythm that you get into, and so then
Hmm.
it's
Yeah.
definitely a
It's a
thing.
it's a whole conversation.
It's a whole conversation. Okay, and then I loved the one somebody said a cloth chicken that I put over my tortillas. Do you picture
It's
this
so
with me?
yes,
Yeah.
it's so specific and I love it.
And so, oh, we love all of the things that you submitted. You made our day by getting to read through all of these, and we'd love to hear. Do you resonate with any of these things? Rice cooker, water filters, another big one for sure.
Yes, yeah,
Electric
for sure.
kettles. Yeah, what are those things that you're thinking of that maybe are outside of the normal things that you we might have seen? We'd love to still hear about that. Um, okay, so we love doing these fun polls. So be looking at our Velvet Ashes Instagram if you want to take part in the polls that we do for each month. The last month, our theme at Velvet Ashes was delight, and so this month, our theme at Velvet Ashes is refuge, not refuge the trash, but refuge
Right.
the place that you go to feel safe and protected.
Hmm.
And so with that being said, there's some things coming up this month in Velvet Ashes that we want to talk about. We want to make sure that you know about. Sarah, talk a little bit about the Equip conference.
We are so excited to bring the Equip conference to our community again this year. And our theme is, strength in the wilderness, kind of that idea of being equipped in the wilderness. And it really connects well with this idea of refuge. As
It
we were
does.
talking, and planning even about the theme of refuge, thinking about in these places of sort of safety, of peace, it's not just a quiet place necessarily that you go to rest. It is that, but it's also the refuge can be a place of equipping. And so as we think about what are the practical needs for women who are on the field. And so we have 3 really great keynotes talking about strength and provision and wisdom in the wilderness, but then also 12 workshops that are about that practical equipping and just coming alongside of you, in the things to say, we see you, we see the questions and the ways that maybe, it's not a life or death need. There are definitely those, but it might just be, how can I find beauty and color and love, the places where I'm at? How can I
Mhm.
put bread on the table for my family and get advice on how to do that in a place where I can't find all the things that I would in my passport country? And so, yeah, there are just really practical workshops for equipping you right where you are.
All of them done by people that live cross culturally. Like women
Mm-hmm.
are, it's this for you by you kind of thing, right? We
Mm-hmm.
aren't seeking wisdom from outside of our community. We know that there's so much giftedness inside our community. So this is us collecting it in one place, delivering it to you. And what I love about this theme is we as global workers, whether we want to or not, are invited into wilderness. There's so much, like when we
Mm-hmm.
say yes to this call, we are going to find ourselves in a wilderness. There's just that comes along with the separation from the support systems we already had in place, the feeling of so few people totally understand what I'm going through, the feeling of who can I connect with and talk to, where do I go? You end up, wilderness will be a part of your story. And how we endure and relate with and interact with wilderness is our role, right? It's there. And so, do we look at it as this place we're going to go kicking and screaming and we're going to fight against? Do we look at it as a place where the Lord meets us there, where we can actually see it as a training ground? Like Moses in the wilderness, the people began to be trained for what God had for them. That it is a place that we can find good things. It doesn't have to be a place we
Mm-hmm.
push against. But it's so interesting, Sarah. I was in my quiet time today. I'm in Hebrews, and one of the verses it says, wasn't it the people who sinned and whose corpses lay in the wilderness? And I was like, we do have a responsibility in the wilderness. We could be a casualty of the wilderness, or we can
Mm-hmm.
look to work with the Lord to grow and actually leave the wilderness for the promised land, for a better place. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's what I hope that this Equip conference is for women. It's part of that. Let's not be afraid of the wilderness. Let's grow there. But and so you and I were talking even before we got on that just this time in our world, refuge means something different. So when we go to the field, we understand that what we're going into is going to be tumultuous, probably. There's going to be anxious places, there's going to be lack of peace. But
Mm.
what for you always was something you could look back on and be like, this, but there is this peace I have. What was that for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think when I went to the field, my idea of, oh, this is a safe place, this is where I feel at peace, was my parents' house. And so it
Mm,
always sort of felt like, okay, my passport country is still home. Like I can go and I can feel rested there. I can just feel like, oh, I can let my guard down. Because that was one of the things I was not expecting about where I lived was, oh, I sort of feel like I always have my guard up of paying
yeah.
attention to safety things and always sort of like sticking out. And so having places where I could just fully let my guard down, especially at the beginning, only felt possible in my passport country.
Yeah.
And, because even where I lived, like the actual house that I lived in
Hmm.
didn't always feel safe.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was for sort of surface reasons like the ants and the mice and, all of that. There was no keeping them out.
Yeah. The things that are alive that you don't want inside your house, but they just come anyway.
Just are there. And then also, just there are always bars on the windows and those types
Yep.
of things. And so even, when your home doesn't even feel like this is my refuge, that can be
Yeah.
really challenging. And so I think one of the things, we were kind of talking about and even thinking about is what happens when your passport country doesn't necessarily feel safe, or there are things
Yeah.
going on that you are removed from that maybe are not directly impacting you in the way that people still back in your passport country are having to deal with. And
Yep.
yet our world, even, we've been back in our passport countries for several years now, and the world is different. Like even the world of social media is different, and
Yeah.
your access to know everyone's opinion on whatever happens is right there. And that can feel really hard to have that kind of disconnect of, there are all these things happening and I can see what everyone is saying, and yet I'm here and I have a perspective now being outside of my passport country. And so Denise, you said it, where is that peaceful place? Where can I
Yeah.
find peace? And that can be really hard when we are carrying heavy things in the places where we are serving that maybe the world is not paying attention to in the way that we wish that they would. And then when there are things happening in our passport country too.
Even just like, what are we allowing into our space through social media? I mean, literally,
Mm-hmm.
we realize we're talking against one of the biggest ways we have access to our community is through social media and online presence. But I was talking to my daughter about this thing called the brick. And I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's something she has on her fridge. And she goes and she taps her phone to it and it shuts off all of her social media for the day. So when she leaves for work, she goes and she's like, Mom, I can't even access it. And so it gives her this space of freedom and refuge, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And then she can't unlock it again until she goes back home and touches it to this thing. And so, what are you doing to cultivate peaceful places when where you are is not peaceful? And what does
Mm-hmm.
peace mean to you? So many good things we're digging into this month on Velvet Ashes through the theme of refuge, so many writers and things. And one thing, we talked about the Equip conference, but another thing that we like to bring to you every year to create moments of refuge is the Unplugged Retreat. And Danielle has done a great job of curating that for you again. And we would love to just let you know that if you are a Velvet Ashes annual member, you already have access to this year's Unplugged Retreat. It goes live October 1st. And if you are not a Velvet Ashes member and are listening to this, for you, it will be available for purchase the 27th. October 27th, the general public will have the opportunity to purchase this, but it's included in annual membership for those Velvet Ashes members. So we are just hoping that as we stand here with you in this community and as the Lord invites us to be a source of encouragement and assurance for you in this place, that you would benefit from some of the resources like the Unplugged Retreat for this year. So, Sarah, I'm excited about your conversation. You want to talk a little bit about the interview that you did this month?
We are bringing you the story of Annalena Tonelli. And Rachel Pieh Jones is, she's a longtime cross-cultural worker. She has a lot of cross-cultural experience. She's written several books, including Stronger Than Death, which is about the life of Annalena. Annalena was she was an Italian woman who worked in a couple of different places in Africa, particularly in sort of medical care, coming up with ways to help with tuberculosis, especially.
Mm-hmm.
And she has a pretty radical story. Rachel and I got into that and some of the wrestling that we both have done thinking about Annalena's story.
Wow.
I will say that Annalena's story ends tragically. She was killed.
Mm-hmm.
And so just as you enter into her story, we want you to know that up front.
And it's timely because the anniversary of that death is October 5th. So as we talk about her story, it is, with that anniversary coming up, but also Rachel will be speaking publicly in the UK on the 17th. So if you happen to be hearing this and you are in the area, we'll put information about that in the show notes for you. But we hope you really enjoy this month's edition of the Velvet Ashes Legacy Podcast. We'll see you back here next month. We look forward to you listening to the interview with Rachel Pieh Jones about Annalena Tonelli.
Every voice part of the symphony. A Halloween polyphony. The messy middle mystery. The legacy of mercy, baby. Ooh.
friends. I'm Sarah Hilkman, and I am here with Rachel Pieh Jones. Rachel has extensive cross-cultural experience, and she is the author of several books, including Stronger Than Death, which covers the life of Annalena Tonelli, which we will be digging into today. So Rachel is a friend of Velvet Ashes. She's written posts for Velvet Ashes, and we've read several of her books in book club. So Rachel, it's so fun to have you here on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Sarah. I love Velvet Ashes, so it's really fun to have a conversation today.
Yeah. Well, Rachel, as we kind of get into Annalena's story, there are parts of her story that are not easy, including the tragic end to her life. And so I just kind of want to acknowledge that up front, but I'm so grateful for just for you bringing her story to us and helping us remember who she was and her impact. So I'm looking forward to, even though there are those hard parts, I'm looking forward to getting into her story. And kind of as we start out, your cross-cultural life was personally impacted by her life and her death. Can you share as we get started about kind of that intersection?
Yeah, it's a really interesting way to start, which is really at the end of her life, but the start of my interaction with her. My family moved from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Somaliland, which is northern Somalia, in 2003, in roughly January. She was living there at the same time. I actually never met her personally. My husband met her one time, but I never met her. We lived there. I kind of knew about her because there was only probably 6 or 7 foreigners living in that village at the time. So we, of course, heard about her. But in October of 2003, spoiler alert, like you said, her death, she was assassinated in the village just a few blocks from my house. And so after that, well, the next morning, actually, my housekeeper came to our house. I hadn't heard anything during the night. And my housekeeper, I didn't speak very good Somali yet. And she said this phrase that I thought meant Annalena was hit. And I thought, oh, maybe she fell down. That's too bad. I'm sorry. But the word can also mean killed. And so very quickly I learned that word means killed. And then our life just flipped upside down. My husband had been a professor there. We intended to stay for longer than just about 10 months. But after her assassination, we were ordered to the capital city of the North, where we stayed for about a week. We went back to our home, and then 10 days later, a British couple who were teachers, also in the region, not in our same village, but another village, they were assassinated. And at that point, the government and the university, they said, we can't guarantee your safety anymore. We need you to leave. And so we had 30 minutes to pack a bag. We fled the country. And at the time, I remember thinking, what on earth just happened to my life? And also, why was this woman, especially Annalena, why was she killed? Because everyone we talked to in those weeks following her death and through our evacuation process, every Somali person we talked to said we just loved her. They adored her. They respected her. They were devastated that we had to leave. There was actually protests against us leaving. And so I was wondering, who was she? But I had 3-year-old twins at the time. We were, fleeing with a backpack and a little carry-on suitcase with all of our stuff that we had. And so I just didn't have capacity to think about really anything, just my own family survival and what are we going to do now? We ended up moving to Kenya for 3 months and then eventually resettled in Djibouti, which is where then we stayed for the next 20 years. But as my life got back kind of on track and stabilized a little bit, and even as my kids got older and I had more capacity, I started to wonder more about her. Who was she? Why does everybody continue to say we love her and then someone killed her? And then a friend of ours who had been in the village as well, another American family, he actually produced a short film for the UNHCR about her life. And as he produced that, he said he realized she was way more than we thought. We didn't know anything about her. And so he reached out to me and said, hey, I think you should consider writing about her life. And as soon as I did, or as soon as I started thinking about it and dove into some research, I realized that I had no idea who this incredible woman was who'd been living just a few blocks away from me. And so then that, launched my own experience and journey of writing about her, learning about her, and personally being transformed by her after her death. So that's a initial story, I guess, of how she impacted me, both geographically. My family had to move.
Right.
Professionally, in my writing career, that was my first book with a publisher, was her story. And then just spiritually, and in terms of my love and care for development work in Africa, it just really, yeah, she had a huge impact on me.
Wow. Yeah. One of the things that struck me, Rachel, as you were talking was there are so many people who have served and who have made a great impact, but we don't know their stories. And so it is so important for people like you who say, I want to know more about this person, and this story needs to be told, you know. So yeah, what an interesting start to your story of cross-cultural work, but then also, yeah, for you to take Annalena's story and to be able to tell it. So we want to dig into more of her story. Let's now go back. You know, you said we kind of started at the end a little bit of her story, but let's go back and talk about her childhood and her background. You know, where was she from? What was her family like? Her childhood like? Can you tell us more about that part of her life?
Yeah, she was born in 1943 in a town called Forlì, Italy. It's located kind of in the belt across the boot of Italy, so central east, a little bit close to the water. Not a very large town. And she was born at right in the middle of World War II. And so as she grew up in a Catholic family in post-war Italy, this was also the time of the Second Vatican Council, which was really transformative for the Catholic Church. So that post-war surroundings, as she grew up in that, as people came back from the war, as they were trying to reestablish themselves economically, recover from their own trauma and all the things that had happened, along with the Second Vatican Council, which really transformed how Catholics thought about people of other religions, especially Muslims. And it had a very significant motivating factor for the lay people in the church, that ministry and care for other people should not just be coming from the clergy, but also could be done by, and really, people could really flourish in participating in, even if they were lay people, participating in the life of the church and service. So those things were really impactful for her. And then when I was interviewing one of her good friends who spent many years with her in Africa, I asked this woman, her name was Maria Teresa. I said, what was one of the most significant influences on Annalena? And Maria Teresa just said immediately, Gandhi, Gandhi, Gandhi. And so they had been reading a lot of his work and were really influenced by how Gandhi chose peace and presence and care in his work. And so those are some of her influences. Post-war Italy, it did see a lot of poverty, but there was also a lot of rebuilding. And so she started to participate in, she kind of found in her town a place where a lot of low-income people had moved into. And so she sort of talked about discovering this place. Of course, she really didn't discover it, but for herself, it was a discovery, and started going there to care for people who were just deeply in need of either economic support, sometimes healthcare, or even just a presence, like a person to be with them in their challenges. And she would drag along friends to this place. They didn't want to go. They felt like it was dangerous. And so several of the people I interviewed said, yeah, we thought she was a little bit, not crazy, but just so radical and so bold to go to this kind of place, which was very nearby in their town. And she would just continue to go. People called her beautiful, charismatic, but also quite humble. She loved to read. All these kinds of things were part of her upbringing. And the people would joke that the hospital when she was born must have been giving out a lot of brains because she was highly intelligent. And there was an expectation from her family that maybe she'd become a doctor or a lawyer. And she pursued that for a while, but pretty quickly realized, like, that's not what I want. I just want to be with people. And especially she kept talking about the least of these, people who are very poor, who were neglected by society, who didn't have what the world would value. She just wanted to be with them. And so eventually, long story short, but she ended up in Kenya in 1969 through another Italian friend, made some connections to go to Kenya and teach there. And she was teaching in a region called Nyeri, which is a little bit central west, kind of. I'd have to look at a map to really clarify, but it was lush and green, and she enjoyed it. And then when she was there in Nyeri, she was learning a lot about the after effects of colonialism There was a resistance movement among the Kenyans called the Mama resistance. She was learning about that. It had aspects of it that was quite violent. So she was learning about the region, but she wasn't satisfied in Nyeri. And at one point, she decided to just kind of explore other places. And she visited a town in what was then called the Northern Frontier District of Kenya. Majority Muslim peoples, a lot of Somalis, a lot of different people groups lived up there. And she went to a town and just fell in love with it. It was harsh climate. And even this is something that people are surprised by. Like, nobody falls in love with this part of Kenya. Very harsh, very dry, very hot, very remote, especially at that time. And Kenyan teachers would often pay bribes to avoid getting placed there. And she just fell in love with it. And she saw people who she thought she could come alongside and serve. And so she asked to be placed there. And of course, the government was like, if you want to go there, sure, we'll send you there. So she moved there. And then Maria Teresa, this woman from Italy, came and joined her. And eventually a few other women joined her there. She started as a teacher. But eventually, shortly after her time there was a cholera epidemic. And this epidemic, she just felt like, I need to help. And so she went to the hospital to help there. Turned out she discovered the hospital didn't have much of anything, including staff, medication, not enough beds. People who were sick were sharing beds. There was medicine being passed around if there was any. And so she realized pretty quickly that that was a place she could contribute, specifically in terms of tuberculosis. At the time, tuberculosis was essentially a death sentence, especially in this part of the world, because treatment would take up to 18 months. And Somalis are traditionally nomadic, especially in this part of Kenya. There's no way a nomadic Somali is going to stay at a hospital for 18 months, especially when the medication makes you feel sick and you just don't want to be there. They're also so communal that the idea of taking all this medicine for yourself is, they were not going to do that. So if they had medicine and someone else was sick, they would share it. And so people were leaving treatment early. They weren't getting the medicine they needed. Drug-resistant tuberculosis was becoming a real issue. And she realized, actually, she was talking with people from the WHO and different health workers, and learned that tuberculosis could be treated by essentially a good management system. Even that was more important than being a really trained medical doctor. So she did get some medical training, but she also just developed a system of management of this treatment. And she built this is kind of her big, what do you call it? Her new idea that transformed tuberculosis treatment for the rest of the world, essentially, was she built something called the Bismillah Manyata, which is the village in the name of God. She invited Somali nomads to come and they would live outside. So she had this huge property that a local sheikh, a religious leader, had given her. And they would build their huts outside. They would bring their animals. They could come with family. So now they're not inside a hospital. And she would oversee their treatment to the point of watching people actually take each individual pill, which they're taking multiple pills a day. So she's doing this every day. She would sleep like 4 hours a night and wake up to make sure people were getting their treatment. She made people sign agreements to stay, and if they wouldn't stay, she would chase them down, or she would chase down a relative to make sure they would stay. And because she was able to, what they call now, directly observe the therapy, the treatment was shorter. And so people would end up staying for 6 months, 9 months, and then they would stay because it was shorter treatment. They had their animals with them. They had their own hut, which is, they're airy, so it's not like being inside a building. She built a mosque. She built schools for kids on the compound. And Kenya had given her permission to manage this project. And up to that point, tuberculosis treatment in the region had been 33% effective. Her treatment was 93% effective because people would stay. And so this ended up transforming tuberculosis treatment. So that was like her big thing. I can talk about that for a long time. But because of that, because of how she was caring for the people with her presence, because they knew she was Catholic, but she had built this mosque. She just took delight in watching people pray. Even she commented often on how they would, even if they were sick and coughing from tuberculosis, they would come out of their huts to make sure they were praying. So she found a lot of spiritual joy and fulfillment from kind of this partnership with Somali Muslims. And then that relational connection, that bond became really powerful. So that's her tuberculosis thing. In I'll skip ahead. In 1985, there was a massacre, kind of coming down from the Kenyan government against a particular Somali clan in her town. And because it was instigated by the government, it was really top secret. No news was supposed to get out. And she just had this absolute conviction of caring for anybody in need, whether they were sick or hurting or poor or lonely, whatever it was, she was going to take care of them, and always saw the human dignity and the value of every person. Mm-hmm. And so when this was happening, she said absolutely not, and started going out to a bunch of men. Hundreds of men were being held at an airstrip. So she started going out to get them and try to rescue them, and they were just being massacred. And so because she was involved in trying to rescue them, eventually when she couldn't find any more people who were wounded, she would bring them back to her clinic to try to treat them. Eventually, her and a local Somali partner ended up just gathering bodies. They buried a large number of bodies on her compound, and the government was in denial that this had ever happened. And so she was smuggling out lists of the names of the dead out with people to the capital, to Nairobi, where then hopefully they could get some help from anybody. Actually, I was on book tour for this book, and I was speaking in Minneapolis, and a Somali man was there. And before I spoke, he came up to me and he said, "I was one of those guys who smuggled out the list of names." She had sewn the list into his pants, into his trousers, and so he got out with a list of some names. But because she had done that so visibly and so aggressively, the government was like, "We're done. We don't want you here anymore." Mm-hmm. And so they kicked her out. And she was not allowed to return. She did eventually kind of sneak back in a couple of times, but that was the end. So she'd been in Kenya from 1969 until 1985. Okay. And so her family thought maybe she'll come back to Italy. But Annalena, she was never going to go back to Italy. And so she ended up going to Somalia instead. She spent some time in Mogadishu and then a coastal town, Merka. And this had been 1985. It became the 90s. The civil war in Somalia exploded. She again was treating tuberculosis there, and just started again a school for children. People were unhappy with her. At some point, she was always getting death threats, various things. She was in a different town in Somalia, Beledweyne. She and a number of other Italians were taken hostage for a while. Eventually, were rescued. I got to interview a couple of the other hostages that had been held with her, and hearing their stories about that time together with her was just incredible. Everyone that I talked to could not get through their stories about her without tears in their eyes. And this was, many years later after these events, right. But just how she would be making jokes. They think they're going to be maybe killed by these people who have kidnapped them, and she's teasing them, and just because she was so confident in her faith, I think, and didn't value her life more than the life of anybody else. Just sort of took things as they came. And so, eventually the war just meant she couldn't maintain her strict tuberculosis treatment in Somalia. So again, she left. This time she went to northern Somaliland, ends up in the village where we ended up crossing paths, theoretically. And while there, again, tuberculosis. And she also started a school for the deaf for students. At that time, if a child was deaf, the family just didn't see a lot of value in that child. And so she would welcome them to the school. She joined a campaign along with a local religious leader, a Somali guy, to campaign against female genital mutilation. And so her stories about that are actually also really fascinating. I'd love to share more about that if we have time. And then she ran this clinic in northern Somaliland. That was very long-winded kind of overview of her story. So many fascinating things that she was involved in.
Yeah. Do you know, Rachel, I mean, you said she was very smart. She, there's kind of this pressure or whatever to be a doctor or lawyer. Did she have medical training that led her into this tuberculosis work, or influenced some of these, the programs that she developed and that type of thing?
I think I know her interest in the medical work came before the actual training. So she had been
Okay.
trained as a teacher. She had some training as a lawyer. But then when she was in the hospital initially, when this cholera epidemic happened and saw what needed to happen, she ended up going to, I think, Spain and London to do a couple of tropical medicine training courses.
Okay.
Nothing in terms of becoming a doctor, but some of these courses. And then her brother, Bruno, was a doctor, and he came, actually spent, I forget how long, but maybe even a year with his wife and children with her. And then she also always made sure she was partnering with WHO, with local doctors. So she had nurses, Kenyan or Somali, who were partnering with her, and then a number of Italian doctors as well who came alongside. And really, because they were the ones who had to manage the medication.
Hmm.
So in order for her to have permission from the government to run these programs, she needed actual physicians there for the medication side.
Yeah. Do you know what her family thought? I mean, you mentioned they hoped maybe she would come back after she had to leave Kenya, but kind of through this whole journey of the type of work that she was doing and the places where she was working, do you know what her family thought about all of this?
Yeah, actually, that was a fascinating part of it. Her brother Bruno, like I said, came with his wife and their young children for a while to live with her in when she was living in Wajir, northern Kenya. And he told me he was very uncomfortable with how his kids were playing with kids who had tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is airborne, highly contagious, and so he just had struggled with that. And I appreciated his honesty about that. And he said eventually we just couldn't stay. That wasn't the place for me. It was the place for her, but it wasn't the place for me and my family. And that kind of response to her life was helpful to me because I didn't also want to live in the same way she did necessarily. But he also, after she died, there was a movement to, what do you call it, beatify her in the Catholic Church to
Okay.
turn her into a saint. And
Hmm.
her family really resisted that. They did not want that to happen because they felt like that was never her ambition. She actually maybe wouldn't have wanted a book written about her. And they resisted even this book for a long time, that they didn't want it to be written. A journalist, an Italian journalist, had written a book shortly after her murder that I don't know. I don't know all the things that it said, but they felt like it got things really wrong. It didn't understand her motivation or her faith well.
Hmm.
It kind of like hyped it all up to make it
Hmm.
more sort of fascinating to the world than they thought it was
Right.
really. And so it took me a year to get permission from her family for them to be open to talk to me. And nobody else would talk to me until I talked to them. They would all say, talk to Bruno first. And
Hmm.
I was praying about it and thinking about it and had some very good conversations with him eventually where I was able to explain my perspective as a Protestant, not a Catholic, and as a woman who had lived in the same region for a long time. And they found those two that a very fascinating combination of someone who could kind of as someone sort of like her, but also
Right.
distant from that Catholic push to beatify,
Hmm.
that I would hold her story with honor and respect and not
Mm.
kind of sensationalize it in any direction.
Sure.
And so eventually they said, that's why we said yes to you. And then I actually went there. They had still been saying no. And I went to Italy and said, I'm here. Can I meet with you for lunch? And they said, okay, fine. Come meet with us. We'll meet you and see what we think. And
Okay.
so I had lunch with Bruno and his wife, and we just had a wonderful conversation. And they said, yeah, actually, we think we would like you to do it. And so once I had their permission, then everybody else, Maria Teresa, all these other doctors and people, they would ask me, do you have Bruno's okay on this? And I would say yes. So in that sense, they were very protective of her because
Hmm.
they saw the depth of what she had done and didn't want it to become sensational.
Right.
Yeah, they did also really recognize that she was radical and not everyone's going to live that way. For example, another one of my favorite conversations I had was with Maria Teresa. I just loved her right away. She told me when they were living in Kenya, in Wajir, they would get these packages from Italy. And she said, Rachel, I would make sure that I got the packages first because if Annalena got a package, she would give everything away. I wanted that chocolate, she said. I wanted those little perfume sachets. And the
Right.
only things Annalena would ever keep were books. And so I just thought that was so funny. And Maria Teresa said, Annalena would sleep on the floor. I actually have a blanket that someone gave me of hers that it's just a very thin blanket she would lie on. And Maria
Mm.
Teresa said, as soon as the cockroaches and the spiders were crawling on me, I was up in the bed. There's no way I'm sleeping on the floor. And so There's people like that, or like Bruno, how he said, I couldn't live there. That was for Annalena. That made me feel like more realistic
Yeah.
instead of, she is an unusual, radical person, and not everybody has to live that way. But there's ways we can do, a little bit. But she's was a
Right.
unique person.
Yeah, no, even just in what you have shared, Rachel, I have had a similar thought in reading your book and even watching some videos that I have seen about her life and just thinking, yeah, there's no way I could do that. But I do think she had a very specific calling and was following God in the way that she felt like she was supposed to. And just some of what you were sharing from the beginning of her life, of the places that she was going that people didn't necessarily want to go, even in her home country, that there was a boldness and a passion. I don't know. Yeah, just something in her that we don't have to necessarily feel like, oh, we have to live in the way that she did. Um, and so, yeah, I think it's part of what makes her story so interesting. But also, it can be, we can think, what is God calling me to?
Yeah, I wrestled with that because I thought that I had kind of some things in common with her. I also was a
Mm-hmm.
foreign Christian woman who moved to the exact same place to try to do something good. And then realizing like, well, I haven't done anything by comparison. But then one of the people that I interviewed for the book, they had asked her that same question. Like, how should I feel compared to you? And she actually said to them, this is for me. You do you. And
Mm-hmm.
really open to how other people were called and never ever pressured someone to live like her. She was pretty tough. Like if you came to work with her, you were going to be working hard. And if you couldn't handle that, you could maybe leave. But she didn't expect everyone to live exactly like her.
Mm-hmm.
She just was doing, yeah, what she felt called to do, loving the people
Mm-hmm.
she felt called to love in the way she felt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You've shared a little bit about her death. Is there anything else kind of around that, of the circumstances, what you know about how what happened as she was assassinated?
Yeah. So, like I said, at the time, I didn't know really anything that had
Mm-hmm.
happened. But building up to that point, so that was in October 2003. Earlier, actually, even about a year ago, she'd started to receive a lot more pressure. She'd always had some kind of pressure. Not everyone was happy that a foreign Christian was living among them and things like that. She never evangelized or spoke openly, aggressively about her faith, but just her presence could rile people up. And so there have been some death threats. There have been some protests against the clinic, especially in northern Somaliland, because HIV started impacting tuberculosis. And an employee of the WHO told me that actually Annalena was, in his opinion, one of the first people, at least regionally, to recognize the impact and the interplay between HIV and tuberculosis, which is a highly potent and dangerous combination of diseases. And she had had this very excellent cure rate of tuberculosis up to that point, but she started to recognize that the treatment was being less effective, that people weren't responding to treatment very well, and she wondered if part of it was HIV. So, and it was. So then what was happening was because she had started this clinic in the village, a village named Borama, people were coming there to get treatment. So people with TB and with HIV, contagious diseases, were coming to this village where they had not come before. And so the villagers started to feel like under threat, that now these diseases are coming here. And she also partnered with a woman named Edna Aden, who was the former prime minister's wife of Somaliland, Somaliland. Um, she runs a hospital in Hargeisa in Somaliland. They were partnering, and Edna was sending people with HIV or with tuberculosis to Annalena. So this idea that Annalena was bringing people with tuberculosis and HIV to the village technically was true. She wasn't, there was rumors that she was putting these diseases into the water, or that she would give medicine to kids for worms, just which is a
Mm-hmm.
very easy to access medication there. And people started spreading rumors that was some kind of contained some of these diseases. So these rumors were getting spread, and people just didn't understand how this stuff worked yet at that time. And so tensions were broiling against her. And then she won a very high, meaningful UNHCR award called the Nansen Refugee Award. And she had never pursued publicity up to this point, but her friends and family convinced her, like, hey, you should come and accept this award in person and give a speech. It was one of her first and only pretty significant public speeches. And she won a significant amount of money, which she intended to invest into the clinic. She never took any money for herself. And so now she's also got this money, and she's also become more high profile internationally because of this award. And so that's kind of in the background happening. I didn't know, again, any of it. And then when she was assassinated, a man came up to her in the clinic at night with two Somali nurses who were with her, and I spoke to them about this night and said her name and then shot her in the head, just like that. And the rumor that I heard right away was that he was a disgruntled employee, or that he was someone that had thought she promised him a job that didn't pan out. And so that was what people thought at first. Eventually, what I think is what happened is that there was also happening at the same time a group of men who were agitating, I guess, to be more visible and known as terrorists. Not, I mean, they wouldn't just say terrorists. They wouldn't have used that word. But they were looking for a high profile foreign target that would get them known among that, Al Qaeda community, sort of where they could get then funds, access to training, maybe fighters would come and join them. And so Annalena was one of those people who my family and the other American family I knew there had armed guards who lived in our compounds. We were pretty careful about where we went and when we went. We were always supposed to be home after dark, things like that. And she just did not have any of that. She did not have armed guards. She just was very open, and so she was kind of a soft target. And also this had this high profile kind of visibility because of the award. And so it worked. That group went after her. It was effective. They were the precursors to what is now Al-Shabaab, which is the group in Somalia that's pretty violent. And so that was interesting to reckon with when I started to realize that, like, retrospectively, my family was also a pretty soft target. We did have an armed guard, but I had no expectation that he would ever really protect. I mean, he wanted to protect us, but I wouldn't expect someone to give their life for me in any way. But we were American, and that's already more high profile. We had children, which makes us slow moving. And so looking back, like, oh, it could have gone a different direction for me personally. And that was something I had to really reckon with as I spoke to her family, who still is, at that time when I talked to them, very emotionally affected by this, of course.
Sure.
Yeah. So that was why she died, and how the man eventually was the shooter. The one who most people had thought was the shooter was eventually arrested. I believe he was recently released, but served 15 years or something.
So, Rachel, what happened after her death in terms of this work that she was doing? Did it keep going? What happened to everything that she had established?
Yes, the clinic in Borma is still there. It's still running. I toured, well, last time I was there was 2018, but I'm sure that it's still going. They do have more funding issues. It's harder to access funds, especially as Somaliland is not a officially internationally recognized country even. And so that's a factor. It affects what other countries are willing or able to go there or invest in it. That said, the local population has really, from the very beginning, they rose up to help. So people were providing food. The local government was providing funds, and staff were coming. So it is still operational on a smaller scale. Yeah, and the deaf school is still operational as well. And I think even the female genital mutilation or female genital cutting campaign continues. It's hasn't been resolved yet, but I know that Edna Adden and some of the other leaders in the Boroma area are still active in that.
As you think about Annalena's legacy and kind of what our community can take away from her life and her ministry and all of this, it's been over 20 years since her death. What are some of the things that you hope people will think about or wrestle with or learn from her, be encouraged by her?
There's so many things. One, she was very humble and willing to admit when she changed her mind, even though she was a leader and a public person. And I feel like that is really hard for people to do, to admit that they've made a mistake or maybe gone too far, and then to change course publicly. So that is something that I took a lot away from. I'll share a story about that, and then I'll share some more lessons from her life. But so female genital cutting is something that Somalis are kind of known for in the West. It's a complicated, very fraught cultural issue that I rely on Somalis themselves to tell me and help me think through how to wrestle with it. Cutting is often a preferred term because it's less judgmental than mutilation, but that at the time when she was there, it was mutilation. So she had raised 5 girls who didn't have family when she was in Kenya. And in the early 80s, I was sitting on a train in Italy reading her letters, her journals, which her brother had given me. And I'm reading along, and all of a sudden I read this sentence, and I just gasped and dropped the journal on my tray on the train and just sat for a while with it, because she had said, I cut my girls. And that's not a direct quote, but I just, what? Not she personally, but she hired the midwife. The midwife came in with these 5 girls and circumcised them. And I also had a chance to talk to one of them later about that experience. And I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand why she would do that, how to think about that. It just really rattled me. And she talked about it, why she did it. She said, these girls are being raised by a foreign Christian woman, and it's so important that I keep them in their community, that they can still identify with their people. And I've since spoken to other Somali women who were raised in that era, and they say, of course she did that then. That was 30 years ago. We think differently about it now, but at that time, they were so impressed that she would be that committed to keeping them culturally rooted in what their community values were. At the same time, I still struggled with it. Okay. Then later, when she moves to Somaliland in the north after 99, 2000, she started partnering with local Somali midwives and this Somali religious leader, Sheikh, to campaign against the practice. And so what I found so fascinating about that is what she's giving a speech at one point where they're talking about stopping doing it, and she started hiring midwives who had been known for that. She would hire them as cleaners or as different kind of staff in her clinic. But then she said, you can have foreign, UN or whoever wants to come in and say whatever they want to say about FGM and tell you what to do or not, but I have done it. I'm speaking from experience, not experience of having it done to herself, right? But like participating in it. And I've changed my mind about it. And that way, like her ability, because she'd been so much a part of it, not coming in as an outsider, and then the way she partnered with local people, I saw such humility and willingness to wrestle with her own choices that I would like to carry forward, to be that transparent, to be able to partner with local people who maybe know differently than I do. Of course, they know differently than I do, and to learn from them and to be changed by that. I feel like that is something I don't see very often in expats who, especially from the West, we think we know it all and we've got some training and some ideas, but that willingness to be humble and to admit it and then to be public about it was very transformative for me. So that's one lesson I hope that people would take from her story.
Yeah.
I also think another complicated issue that her story brings up is the white savior complex. And it's something I had to address very directly as a white woman writing about a white woman in Africa. And so how do we think about that? And I would ask people directly, was she white savior? And some people said, no, we didn't have that term back then. It didn't mean the same thing. Some people said, yes, absolutely she was. And then some people would say, let's complicate the term. What do you mean? And if you mean, like, did she actually save people from dying? Yes, she did. If you mean, was she doing it for her own gratification and for her own glorification and her own, making money and having all this? No, she wasn't. She was committed to eating what the people ate at her clinic, to sleeping on the floor, to never valuing her own life higher than their own. And so, people that she had actually saved their lives would say, okay, if technically she was white and she saved my life, but I'm okay with that because of how she did it. and because of how committed she was to it to the end of her life, actually to death. And so I think when we talk about the white savior complex, there's a complex about it, and there's also a way to do it with that involves that humility and partnership and longevity that can shift the conversation. It's still an important conversation to have, but yeah, I think she modeled a different way of being a foreigner in a place like that. And then just the radical love she had for the poor, for the needy. She didn't, there's debate about, do you call them the poor? Of course not. She knew all their names. She knew their family names. She had this incredible memory, but they were technically low income. They were people who needed help. So her willingness to come alongside, to not be afraid of the diseases they carried or the stigma that might come from it, even the violence. Some of the people who were violent against her, she would feed them the next day. She would hire them eventually. So her real commitment to the humanity and the dignity of every person, I think that's really important. And then, this week I was thinking, so we're recording this interview less than a week after Charlie Kirk was shot in the US. And I'm not going to get at all political, but there's been a lot of talk in the US right now about freedom of speech and our need to talk to each other and engage in conversation. And absolutely, yes, let us talk and engage. But also, I think what her story really reminds me of is that it has to be more than talk. It has to also be active partnership, even with people we disagree with, right alongside them, doing things that are hard, sharing a purpose, watching people be restored to fullness of life, like actually doing life in action together with intentionality and with mutuality across those borderlines of difference that goes way beyond conversation. And conversation, talking about that can give the idea that at the end of a dialogue, you'll be in agreement. But if you're doing an activity, which I think is false, like we're not necessarily going to be in agreement just because we have a dialogue. But if you do an activity together, there's no need to be in agreement except about the need for seeing the humanity of the other person and partnering. So those are some things that I think are really important, whether it's about, economic issues, climate issues, loneliness epidemics, health problems. How can we really partner and do something together while we dialogue?
Yeah. Rachel, I appreciate your willingness to wrestle with some of the things that, maybe are harder for us as outsiders to understand, or just the things that, are just hard, hard about Annalena's story, or the times in which she was working. And I think one of the things that it can be tempting to do as we look back at some of these, whether it's a long time ago or even, more recent, to look back at some of these cross-cultural workers, and kind of like you said, there was the fear around sensationalizing Annalena's life and her story. And I think we can do that. We can sort of like gloss over the hard parts and just remember the good parts. But I think we can learn so much when we do wrestle with the things that maybe we don't understand or that are different. And then moving from just conversation, like you were saying, to what does it look like to partner and do the work together, and to focus on that. And so, yeah, just thank you for your willingness to do that as you have honored Annalena's story and her life too.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a huge honor to be able to write her story. I'm thankful for the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all the work that you put into it, all the travel and conversations. And yeah, I can imagine that was very fulfilling in some ways, but also, yeah, that was a lot to do.
Yes, it was both. Yeah, loved it.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for your time, for what you have done to help us remember Annalena's story and make sure that her life is not forgotten, that we can honor her and learn from her and continue wrestling and thinking about our own lives and what it means to follow what God is calling us to in our lives. Friends, as always, we are so grateful to Barnabas International for sponsoring this podcast and for the work that they do to shepherd global workers and train global shepherds. You can find out more about them at barnabas.org. Thanks so much for listening to the Velvet Ashes Legacy Podcast.
Every voice part of the